My name is Jake Coolidge. I currently work as a public defender, but I think probably more apt to this discussion is I spent my time before I was a public defender doing work, as was mentioned, with the criminalization of poverty. As such, I want to say that what I'm saying is removed from the state agency that I'm employed with. And I also want to highlight that what I'm talking about is kind of as police as an institution and not specific to Missoula Police Department or Missoula Sheriff's Office, although I'm confident that some of these things obviously apply to both of those groups. I know definitively that some do. So first, when asked these questions, they're great questions. The first question that I focused on was who is policed, and obviously we're all policed, right, to a certain degree. But when you study policing and look at policing kind of as a social function, there are certain people in society who are disproportionately policed, which I think is really the question, is who is exposed to policing more, because we're all obviously policed. And I think there's some dynamics that allow for people in poverty, again with the criminalization of poverty, as my studies have focused on, is that you see that they're disproportionately exposed to policing in a way that people of middle or higher socioeconomic statuses are not. For instance, when you think about things like housing, even if you take it as one step of like people who live in an apartment have a pretty much higher likelihood of engaging with police officers because of neighbor complaints, because of tighter spaces, less private spaces. And if you take that a step further and you associate homelessness, it's like that's a group that has a drastically disproportionately high rate of engagement with law enforcement officers. So for instance, like if you think about if any of us following this meeting want to, drink an alcoholic beverage or like smoke marijuana, for instance, and we do so in the privacy of our own home, the likelihood of engaging a law enforcement officer is remarkably low. But if a homeless individual makes the exact same decisions, their likelihood of engaging a law enforcement officer is similarly remarkably high. So the instances in which people are engaged by law enforcement is disproportionately determined by poverty, not only housing status, but poverty as a whole. I can say with relative certainty that drawing an older car, a dilapidated car, would also probably increase a police officer's likelihood of determining particularized suspicion or probable cause to make an arrest. Also, certain impoverished neighborhoods that have an increased likelihood of criminal activities, higher crime rates, higher drug sales, things that are also directly correlated, at least sociologically, with poverty. They happen in those neighborhoods. So that kind of also bleeds over into policing strategies. Certain types of policing strategies disproportionately affect certain groups. So for instance, like stop and frisk policies in New York City, you stop someone, particularized suspicion, you can search them, it's a warrantless search. What they were using in New York City for years and years and years was, well, we know this neighborhood sells a lot of drugs. That was also correlated with higher urban densities of African American populations, and then their reason for particularized suspicion would be an 18 to 24-year-old African American male. So functionally what was happening is the cops were stopping poor black men and exercising particularized suspicion, basically executing what's called a Terry stop and patting them down, finding what they carried. So what you see when these policies are carried out over time is that people of poverty and people of color are disproportionately impacted by policing. Even though they don't use drugs at any higher rate, they're prosecuted for using drugs at a much higher rate. So basically my conclusion to the who is policed is that it disproportionately impacts people on the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Moving quickly, who is protected by police? This is also kind of the inverse of that, is you have to think about who calls police, who the police serve, and that would typically be people with social and economic capital, people who are likely to rely on the police as a trusted arbiter of conflict, and that's typically people who are not policed, because people who are policed disproportionately don't rely on the police for protection. So the people who rely on police for protection are people who are not policed. People who are not policed are people of higher socioeconomic status. So what we have is a policing system that relies on public approval, and in order to gain that public approval, you have to get the approval that you want, and that's the people who have political capital. So again, when you're talking about isolated pockets of society, their approval is less important than the more loud, more affluent pockets of society. So largely when we talk about who is protected, it's largely the people who have economic and social capital. And this is further demonstrated by when you look at like loss prevention officers and the privatization of downtown officers. Like the downtown police department are the downtown officers partially funded by the Business Improvement District. Of course, their job partially would be to serve the interests of the downtown community. Further, when you look at any big box store, they have a loss prevention officer whose job is to find people who shoplift and report it directly to police, who then prosecute those people. So again, who's shoplifting? Typically people of lower socioeconomic status. Who are they protecting? The corporate interests of the businesses who employ them. So what we have is a system where the police, because of their relation to government function, they enforce people in those positions. And the people who are kind of chewed up by the system are people of lower socioeconomic status, which also happens to fall disproportionately on communities of color, Native Americans in Montana specifically, and as I'm sure we'll hear about, the statistics further enforce that that is the case, and that dynamic is alive in Montana, very much so. So then gets to the next step, kind of who is punished, right? If we know who is policed, it's kind of, in my opinion, disproportionately experienced by people in poverty, and who is protected is disproportionately people on the higher end of things. Then it begs the question, well, what happens when the justice system plays out after people are policed? Which gets a little outside of the scope, but it's a troubling dynamic because you consider things about, well, when these people are policed and arrested, what happens? And I can tell you that they go to jail and there's a bond placed on them. And any person who can afford bonds out, gets an attorney, moves on with their lives. Any person who can't afford bond sits in jail pre-trial. The reason I tell you this in relation to policing is because it creates a direct connection in which policing impacts the administration of justice. Because when a person's sitting in jail for 7 days because they can't afford a bond of $500 and their total penalty they face is 6 days in jail, there's really no reason for them to actually fight the underlying substance of their allegations. What makes sense is to enter a plea because you've already served your time and then to move on with your life. Especially if you consider things like not having a family, not having economic stability, not having housing. The more time you spend in jail, the more in disarray the rest of your life is going to become, not to mention the underlying mental illness things of the criminal justice system. So the reason I bring this up is because if you're poor and policed, essentially, you not only face a different justice system, you literally functionally face a different burden of proof to be convicted of your crimes. Because what actually happens is that you're arrested based on probable cause, and if you can get out of jail, it would be beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury of your peers. What happens when you're held in jail pre-trial because you can't afford pre-trial release is that you're arrested based on probable cause, you're held because you can't afford bail, and then you are left no choice but to eventually plead out, because what's going to happen is you're going to sit in jail for an additional 3 months otherwise. So and there's other instances too. When you talk about who drafts the legislation that dictates punishment, for instance, the war on drugs is a perfect example of something that disproportionately impacts lower socioeconomic status. I don't know how much time I have here.
7 minutes.
Okay. So, yeah. So, I mean, to use another example, is like crack and cocaine are sentenced differently in the federal system. That is to say, the sentencing, and I know we're talking about police, but I think this is full circle, because people are sentenced disproportionately severely for crack than they are for powder cocaine, even though pharmacologically it's the exact same substance. The main difference is that obviously crack cocaine has been used in rhetoric and attached basically to low-income African Americans over time. So that rhetoric has then turned Congress to levy harsher punishments for that. The reason that's relevant is because when we're talking about who is punished, is that we literally see the exact same crime being punished differently in a de facto sense based on socioeconomic status. And how that impacts policing is because then that feeds into crime data and the war on drugs and who's using drugs and who's being arrested for drugs, because that in turn informs policing when they determine what kind of things they can use to articulate particularized suspicion, that is, to execute a stop. So when you have these kind of systems set up that punish differently, and then it creates data that demonstrates falsehoods in sentencing and criminalization of poverty and race, then what happens is that data is relied on for inconsistent policing. And when the data is relied on for inconsistent policing, you see differential outcomes, even at a street level, for what normally would happen. And that's basically what happened in New York with Terry stops, and I'm confident that's what happens in especially so-called border towns in Montana that are near reservations. Is it's the exact same dynamic kind of in a different place. As you see, these places are disproportionately policed heavily, and the justification is because there's higher crime rates, and that's often attached to poverty. So then oftentimes the police are basically patrolling areas where they know Native Americans are, not because they are Native American, but because they use these statistical kind of explanations for how they enforce policy. So I think as a whole, that's kind of what we're seeing, is that at least from what I've seen, there really is kind of this galvanizing effect based on socioeconomic status that kind of results in at least what sociologically is called the criminalization of poverty.
All right. So I'm going to take a kind of different approach to answering those questions. And as Rebecca mentioned, yes, my name's Emily Withnall, and as Rebecca mentioned, I am the co-leader of the LGBTIQ activism group here in town, which is a subgroup under Missoula Rises. And we actually have been engaged in work with the LGBT police liaison in trying to get some trainings around issues pertaining to the LGBT community. However, I'm going to be talking about domestic violence because I know a lot more personally and in the research I've done around it. I am a survivor of domestic violence, and I've also been a bystander. And for my graduate work in graduate school, I did a lot of research, so that's what's informing some of this. So I'm going to be telling some anecdotes and also filling in with statistics. So I will just preface this to say that when I was in my domestic violence situation, I didn't really understand that that's what it was. And that's a whole separate topic. But there were moments when I was being physically hurt within that relationship when I would say, I'm going to call the police. And my ex-husband at that time told me, if you call the police, I'm going to tell them that you hit me first or that it was your fault or whatever. And if I say that, they're going to arrest you too. And I didn't know it at the time, but that's actually accurate. If the police show up and they cannot identify who the perpetrator is, and both people seem to be in some kind of conflict, it's very possible for them to then arrest both people. And then from there, if the victim is arrested, it becomes that much more difficult to take your abuser to court later because you've also been, what's the word? I've lost the word. But you've also been implicated. That's the word. So I never made the call because I was terrified. And then as far as, and then also that in terms of police showing up, and deciding who the perpetrator is, that gets really tricky, and training is spotty. It depends from city to city, town to town. In my hometown at the time, I don't know if it's changed since then, but there was no training around domestic violence response. Here, there's a whole spreadsheet on the Missoula City Police Department that shows how many hours per different thing different police officers have done. And so there are a number of police officers who have been trained in various ways, but that also doesn't guarantee that if you make the call, an officer who has received all the training is going to be the one that is showing up. Another personal anecdote that kind of ties into some of these questions is that even though I didn't ever call the police while I was in the relationship following my divorce, there were a number of times when my ex-husband would try to physically harm me while we were exchanging the kids. And I went to the domestic violence center in my town, and they had a police officer there, and I spoke with him, and he said, well, do you have proof? And I didn't have proof. I didn't have bruises. But I was being threatened every time I exchanged the kids. So he kind of looked me up and down and said, well, where does your ex-husband work? I'll give him a call and give him a warning. So needless to say, I left very quickly. I did not accept that offer. it made me feel more unsafe, honestly. And then in graduate school, as I was doing research, I came across a text called Police Wife, which is an investigative report on police officers that was published in 2015. And it reveals that 40% of cops admit to having been violent with their spouse or children in the previous year. Cops have an abuse rate at home that is 15 times higher than among those who are not officers. 8% of police officers admitted to inflicting severe violence, including strangulation, beating, and using a knife or gun. And these are just self-reported statistics. So I don't know what the number would be. The study also found that police officers were fired following continuous complaints 6% of the time. If disciplined at all, the other 94% of cops with complaints filed against them were ordered to counseling. Protecting each other is considered a professional courtesy. Some call it the blue code of silence. Which also, for me, brings up the question, okay, so if you're a spouse of a police officer who's being abused by the police officer, who do you call? And then finally, my last story is from being a bystander here in Missoula. I saw my neighbor being assaulted by her boyfriend in her driveway in the middle of the day. And I panicked. And because I was following my own divorce, threatened physically as I was exchanging the kids. There were many times in court, because he also took me to court repeatedly, that I had wished that I had some form of record. And so in my panic, I went back and forth for 30 seconds. Do I call the police? Do I not? And I called. At first I yelled. The guy took off. 2 police officers came, a man and a woman, and they questioned me. They asked what I saw. They went and knocked on the door. They talked to my neighbor. She said nothing had happened. They came back to me and said there was nothing they could do because, for all they knew, I could have been making things up and being a vindictive neighbor or whatever, and that they believed me, but they couldn't do anything without her report. And the police woman told me that she had said, "I know you're lying," to the woman who answered the door, which is not at all helpful, because so often if the perpetrator is not arrested, or even if he is oftentimes, the penalty is not that great, and he will be back. And if she reports the story, then she could be at greater risk. Anyway, I was told that all I could keep doing was to keep calling the police, and that what they could do if they got a number of calls was that they could file, or they could cite them for disturbance of peace. And that if they cited them for that would likely result in an eviction. Which, to my mind, when I think about like who is policed and what is protected, I was not protected. After that incident, the neighbor's boyfriend kept approaching me. He approached me in my driveway. He came and knocked on my door one day. And so the neighborhood was not protected. Apparently I could call many times and then maybe they'd be evicted. But that would further punish the victim, who is my neighbor. And she would also go to another neighborhood where this would just happen again. So I'm not really sure who is being protected, because in that I guess a neighborhood full of what, I don't know. I don't really have the answers, but I chose to move because I didn't feel safe, and because I wasn't seeking to further make her life difficult. But I did come to find out later that other neighbors had been hearing screaming and had been making calls, and I saw them moving. I don't know if they were evicted or not, but whatever the case was with that particular incident, there was no resolution for this particular woman. And if I think about who was protected in that particular instance, I would have to say that her boyfriend, who I saw assaulting her in broad daylight, was protected. So I think I'm going to just wrap that up there. I have a lot more notes here to say to that, but yeah, I will leave that there.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That was very...
Excuse me. May I?
Yeah.
Sorry.
My name is Meg Singer. I am a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I am a Hard Hat clan, which is my mother's clan, and then I'm born for Towering House or Kia'ani. And this is what we do as Navajo people, is we introduce ourselves in a traditional way, telling our clans so that we can all know each other and how we're connected. So my Hard Hat clan is actually German, so if anybody has German heritage in here, I'm probably your cousin somehow, maybe. But I just want to, again, thanks for this opportunity to speak to you. I took a little different route. A lot of the work that I do across the state of Montana has to do with the very idea of what policing is. And for me, that starts very, very simply with tracing back the roots of European settlers. So back in the day, I don't know if you guys know this, but Europeans weren't on this continent. They came here because the systems of Europe were so terrible that it was either stay and die or flee and die and try to colonize the world, right? So with that colonization pushed this idea of law and order. So it's really important to know that before European contact, there were several thousands, hundreds of thousands of different tribes, different bands, the idea of what we call nations here, who had their own traditional forms of governance, their own traditional forms of how do you have a society when there's so many individuals, right? So that's the idea of law and order, where law and order comes in. You have this consensus of society, you have this social hierarchy, you have people on the top who are making sure that the people on the bottom are in line with our social mores and norms. So when police are what they're protecting the law. They're not protecting us, they're protecting the law. We create law that is supposed to protect people. We create law that's supposed to protect land, assets, capital. But it comes down to law. It doesn't come down to the humanity of you deserve to be safe because we are in this society together. So as that system of policing, of that system of law and order took its hold in the Americas, something came over a few groups of people. So for example, indigenous people under the law were savages. They were redskins. They were problems that literally had to be controlled through the use of the United States military. For black people, they were 3/5 of a person under the law. For LGBT people, perverts under the law. For immigrants now, for terrorists, for Muslims, there is a pattern here on what law and order actually means. The system that was created, that was pushed from that European idea of unfairness because they didn't have access to that power, was created here. And that's why we come up with these ideas of minorities. Basically, they're people that do not fit into the system. No matter how hard you try, they literally do not fit in the system because, as we know, all men aren't created equal under the law because the law was not created equally for these people. So that comes into this idea of sovereignty that lots of people like to talk about, and it's a election year, and so that's going to be the buzzword of the year, is sovereignty. And this basically is the idea that tribal nations now have the belief, the ability, and the, I don't say gumption, or at least the know-how to be able to govern themselves. But there's so many caveats because of federal Indian law, because of state law, because jurisdiction. All of this is policing Native people, and so their true self-determination cannot be really created right now in this system. So an example. In 1883, there was an incident that happened actually in Montana, the border of Montana, North Dakota, around that area, South Dakota, that area. A Native man killed another Native man. And what happened was the tribes were, their sovereignty of dealing with murder was kept in-house. And the government said, you know what? According to all these laws that we have on the book, remember, it was only 1883, but you do have the right, we recognize the right, the United States Supreme Court recognized the right that you as a tribe can deal with this murder on your own. And so what happened was they did. There was ceremony, there was talking, there was a lot of stuff. There wasn't any physical punishment or corporal punishment. They did it in-house. That's their traditional governance was there. The very first case on murder, a Native person murdering another person. Awesome, right? Then what happened was the American public heard what happened. And they didn't like how lenient the tribe was to the man who had murdered. And they petitioned the government to intervene. And so the government created this act called the Major Crimes Act, which put murder, rape, all of these other things out of the hands of tribe and into the federal government's hands. So now the federal government has all of this stuff that they are in control of. But if you start out connecting with these people who don't think you're human, who call you savages, and as part of their law, stuff happens. You hear there's not enough funding. It happens all the time, especially with policing. Let's look at rape kits. There's not enough funding to do rape kits. No, there's money. You're just not using it correctly. And that's the thing, is that when we start thinking about these things critically, we see that this system does not work. For people, we need to start looking for our traditional forms of governance. One of the coolest things that ever happened to me was one of the scariest things that happened to me when I was a kid. I think it was like 11. I was in my room and a knock on the door. And my mom came out and then she just started yelling. And I was like, uh-oh, brother's in trouble. Went outside, 7 cop cars outside in our street. And they wanted my brother. And my brother is a nerd. So I was like, what did he do? What happened was the night before, the Navajo kid that lived next to us, and we grew up in Salt Lake City. The Navajo kid next to us was out making ruckus. And somebody saw him making ruckus, and he actually vandalized a car. But the person that saw him just said, it was the Navajo kid that lived on this circle. Well, there's 2 Navajo kids on that circle. So we went to my brother, and the cops came for my brother. They didn't ask him any questions. My mom didn't know what was going on. The person that was accusing my brother was, excusing him right there. And my siblings are crying, and it was just so dramatic. And the thing that stopped everything was all of my neighbors coming out and standing between the cop and my mom and my brother. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately, especially now that my older brother is getting his PhD this semester, and he's going to be a dad again. Just how lucky he was to have that community there. And now thinking about it in these alternative forms of justice, that was community right there. That it was all his aunties, all his friends and neighbors, all of them that were there for me. They came out there like that. That should never happen. Should never have happened. My brother was racially profiled, and this happens all the time with Native people. 6% of the population of Natives in Montana are, 6% of the population of Montana is of Native people, and 21% of the prison population is made up of Native people. So that means that there's a 300% chance for a Native person to be incarcerated in Montana. Compare that to their non-Native. 300% chance. And so we see this over and over and over and over again. And so what doesn't need to happen is we don't need the end goal to be more trainings for police or the end goal to be more racially diverse or ethnically diverse or culturally diverse. We need an entire shift on how we think about police. Because the people who need it the most are fighting the police right now. And so the idea is that if we want to have restorative justice, which is that idea that punishment is not the key. It should be more about focusing on relationships between the individual to the community and the community to the individual. If we start focusing on that, things could change. So, I guess to end, I would say that who is protected and what is protected is anyone who fits into what the system was designed for. And I think we're all coming into terms to realize how the system was not designed for really anybody, except for a few people. And I think that's it for me. Oh, thanks.
Oh, missed it. Okay. Okay, I'm Scubby Bakani, and I'm also in Nakota. I'm in Fort Belknap. I also have family from Standing Rock. I see some brothers here from Standing Rock. My best cook just walked out. But, so, I seen something on Facebook and about one of the questions that people were asking, especially about the panel, was, has any of us ever been involved with it? Any of us ever sat time, been part of the system? And I can honestly say yes. I grew up in the system. That's a sad thing to say. Well, it's not really sad. It made me who I am, and that's why I'm still standing. I grew up in the system ever since I made mistakes as a child. My mom's sitting here, and she's had to deal and bail me out ever since I was a little kid. From many different times, from, getting caught at the local res store, stealing candy, to, just doing crimes because it was part of my community and not really thinking twice. In my communities, you never called the cops. It is something you didn't take care of. You took care of it in-house. If somebody messed with you, you didn't call the cops. When I moved to the city and everything like that, I was so scared of the cops. And I grew up with that fear ever since I was a little kid. I still have that fear. Every time I even get pulled over now, I'm so excited to know I have insurance, But it's still that fear inside me, Every time you see those lights turn on, we joke around about it, but it's internal trauma that I have inside myself. Even though I know I'm not going to jail, it's those points of knowing that you're going to jail where you just go get in that cop car. You don't even say nothing. You just get out your car and he's like, whoa, stop. You're like, no, I'm going in. You're trying to get in the back so you can get out earlier or get to lunch, right? Like, that's the life I grew, It's the life I accepted after a while. And so, yeah, I have been in there, but I am a first-generation master's degree student, too. I'm a U.S. combat veteran and a high school graduate, and I'm born and raised right here in Montana. But some of my crimes, when we talk about, I heard about different things from Jim Crow laws to restorative justice, and what I call that's entry point. A cop is an entry point to changing a life of anybody, no matter what color you are. I have friends that I grew up with in Parkdale that I used to go and visit. They're white. He's still in his sit time. It don't matter. We were all the same, It was economic status at one time, but Native Americans, we do sit at a higher rate, and that is true. And when you go, and I heard people, I think at the end, talked about your peers. We don't have jury of our peers in this state. When I look at a jury, I never see a Native American. Never. And so when you go see a defender or anything, they're going to tell you right off the back, you need to plead. I've been not guilty of so many crimes, and it's pissed me off inside because I knew I wasn't guilty. But it's harder for a person of color to prove they're not guilty than they are guilty. Because for us, when we look at it, we look at the max time that you can do. And I have had brothers that have gotten in there and never got out of the system. Because once they got in the system, they just kept getting in trouble. And when you're on probation, if you don't have a job or you're not able to find a house, they throw you back in. And that's the reality that you're having to live, freedom. And so you're talking about like the modern complexity of slavery, it's there. Native Americans, we experience it in this state, in Shelby. And all these new jails and they're trying to open and they're talking about jobs and everything. Do you know how you fill a jail? It's like the same way you fill a Holiday Inn. Same thing. See, people are making money off it. And that's the same thing, and people know about that. Michael Jordan, one of the biggest things I heard from my friends that are part of Black Lives Matter. Michael Jordan owns some jails in North Carolina. He's making money off it. And so these are things that we don't really talk about, and not many people know about, but it's happening right there. And in Montana, the entry point is the police officer. Because that police officer, he has different things that he can write up, right? He can write that ticket to a different thing, right? If the crime is a crime and you're doing the crime, you do the time, right? Like, I'm not saying that. I got friends that are cops, so we went to high school with. They're good friends. I did crimes, and I'm guilty, you know? But at the same time, I didn't do some of the crimes that I got charged with, and I got on my record. But those same crimes, I can't get certain jobs. When I was on probation, I couldn't even get housing. No place would rent to me around here. No place that I'd want my family to live. You know? My probation officer even called the university and let them know that I was on probation. That's how much she went out of her way to make it hard on me. And so I had to go through all this while finding jobs and doing like whatever I could to survive. Because you can't drive either. And you can't get in a car with anybody. Because when you do those things, you get written up and you get thrown back in. And if you have a job, you lost your job. And it's already hard going to somebody for employment because in this state, there is no other box. They make you check if you did a crime in this state, even if you did a misdemeanor. And so I had to deal with that. And then you have to go to group. And your group be way the hell over here. You got no car. You live way on the other side of town. We got winter. Or you got to go do a UA. And the probation officer, he used to be way over there at the jail. And so you had to go, I live at the university. I'm supposed to get all the way over there on a bus, 8 in the morning. Saturday, Sunday, whenever they call you in, you got to get there. And that's how it works. But where it all starts back is it starts back at that police officer that arrested you. And that's one of the things I wanted to share because it's important. Who's being policed? I say it's classism. You know, it's the poor. You know, we know what sides are poor here in Missoula. We know where the cops go. They put it in the newspaper. They try to shame you. You know, so who's being policed? I would say everybody don't have money. You know, you're not making over 3 figures. They're not going up the south side. Up there, you know those nice houses up there where Denny Washington lives? They're not going up there unless he calls them. You know, then they're up there fast as hell. If there's a murder down here, they ain't that fast. Denny Washington called them, they're up there. You know, and that's the truth right there. You know, and then... let's see here, who's being policed? You know, and then one of the things I really seen the biggest thing coming back from Standing Rock is it was, I mean, if you ever got to go there, it was some crazy stuff what's going on in America. I've been to Ferguson too. I was down there when I went to visit my son. And when I was down in Ferguson, same thing as Standing Rock. It was militarized police. Those police were more armed than I was in Iraq. And I was in a war. Those guys had all the same weapons we had. They had like little tanks they were going in with. They were flat jacked up, walking around the streets. And that's how it was. And when we were in Standing Rock, Montana police. So I'm talking from Montana. I'm not saying these stats. These are things I've seen. Montana police, the governor of Montana sent the police from here over there. The only reason Bozeman police did not go there isn't because he didn't want to. It's because he wasn't going to get paid. There was a complex in the deal with the compact. So he wasn't getting paid. That's why he didn't go. That's the truth behind it. He went out and said, hey, I wasn't going to go. I listened to you guys. No, you weren't making money. But the governor, I asked him to actually give that money back to programs. That money never came back. Governor Bullock didn't do that. I'm a strong Democrat, too. Let's throw that out there. But he didn't do that. Anyway, that's a different conversation. But so one of the things, though, that was one of the biggest things, though, I actually seen was who was it policing? Corporations. The state of Montana protected corporations at one time. And we have a lot of laws that are doing that. And so who's being punished? Me and you. Because why? because it's taking that mentality and it's creating people like me, like, you know, back how I used to be. I'm robbing you because I can't do nothing. I'm in the system. I can't get a job at McDonald's, right? And so it's not just the wealthy that is happening. It's happening in a circle because we're all connected, one way or another. I don't even care if you don't know the person. You're seeing the person on that street. That person on the street is connected to you, even if you don't know it. We're all connected because in some way, right, that person's help, even like if he passes away or something, is connected to you. I seen a guy that passed on the bridge. I felt for that guy. I had seen that guy while I was walking around the streets because I work downtown. I seen him, and I know he passed away from freezing. And I thought, what if that was my relative? Because back home on the res, they always say, remember that could be your relative. You know, you treat that person with respect. Because that could be your relative, or that could be you. Because nobody ever plans on being homeless. You know, and so when those police they're doing that, or even if they're just arresting them. In Billings, I had a friend, Joe Simpson. What he was doing, he was actually doing ride-along. They were trying to get those people into treatment and stuff, or trying to get them help. But we don't do that here. So I think when we're talking about us being as progressive as we are, we're not. Because it actually costs, 4 times to 1 to actually put somebody in a prison cell than actually get them help and get them back on their feet. So, what is protected? Denny Washington. And so, I got no problem with the guy. He's a nice guy, actually. But the reason I'm saying that, though, is I'm saying people like that, elite status, it don't matter what color you are. You know, if you're elite status, because Michael Jordan, he's investing against his own people, too, you know, by the prison complex. But who in Montana is being protected? It's the elite people. You know, like if these people, like depending on where you live, if you call the cops, they're going to be there fast. You call the cops in other neighborhoods, they're going to take their time. You know, I remember growing up, too. It started in the mall in Great Falls, where they used to not let us walk around with 4 natives in the mall. They'd break us up because they'd call us a gang or something. We were no gang. We were just walking around the mall because we're friends. If people love white people, they're walking around, they didn't ever nothing. If I was with my white friends, nothing ever happened. It was like a whole different world. It was like you were shielded. You know, it was really weird. Or when my white friends get pulled over, right, they don't get scared. They're like, oh, I'm going to tell that guy something. I wasn't going. Like, no, you look forward. You be quiet. Hand them your licenses, you know. You don't say nothing. Just go. Let's get out of here. Get this over with. You know, and that's the truth, though. And so there's double standards in this state. Native Americans, we do sit in these things, but it's because the entry port is police. And yet, do I ever see a Native cop in a major city in Montana? Tell me when you ever seen one even in Billings. You don't see very many. I don't know if there is. Bozeman, I never seen one. Missoula, never seen one. Great Falls, never seen one. Even roaming around the sands, we have high populations in these places, but I've never seen a Native police, right? And so how am I supposed to listen to somebody that don't look like me? Or the law don't even respect that, right? It ain't like they couldn't do a marketing thing and actually go out and get police of color. Right? Especially Native Americans. We're the highest ethnic group here in Montana. That could happen, though. And so when we're talking about solutions, I don't want to just be complaining. We need to look at the laws, the legislation, who we're electing in there. We need to look at restorative justice that way, because those police have to follow those laws. I think the other thing is limiting militarized budgets. Yes. Right? We don't need militarized in here. We need to actually have stuff that's not militarized and de-escalate. You know, there was a kid that I knew. I used to play basketball in Great Falls. He was just shot. He was shot in Great Falls for just robbing something. He wasn't even doing nothing. He was running, and they shot him in the back. He was 22-year-old. He was a good kid, but he had the papers will go and make him seem like he was some criminal kid, and you know that could be me. And so I see those things, and I take them to heart because it's affecting my community, and now it's affecting kids that I knew, and it's sad. And so the solutions are, I would say, you know, let's get more police of color here. Let's even get women. I mean, anybody, right? Let's try to make it diverse. It don't matter. You know, let's try to get something different. And then laws. Laws are big and important. If you have time, go to Helena. Right? Go to Helena. Speak your voice. Start here at the local level. But it can change, though. There are solutions. Thank you.